I just want to do this first. So this is your cortex, and this is this before we see the video piece of this. What you're going to see is that these are where the cells are being born in this area. This is the brain section here. You see there's no bumps in the brain at this stage of development, but it's hollow and it's filled with cerebral spinal fluid, or what will become cerebral spinal fluid. And then this is lined with cells like this. So if we take this and put it down here, we see that the cells have a migration path to take that eventually brings them to one of these 6 layers of the cortex. And if they don't get to the right layer, they're not communicating with the neurons that they were designed to communicate with. And they're looking at this as a possible cause of, for example, things like schizophrenia. I mean, there are a lot of other things that are possibly associated with this. So inside the brain itself, for every neuron, you have like 10 helper cells. So this would be one of those. They're called glial cells. So they have these long fibers that go all the way from here all the way down to the bottom. And the neurons actually climb up the long projections, the long fibers of the glial cells to get to where they're supposed to be. Now, they know that if a mother is stressed during pregnancy, that the high levels of cortisol in the mother's blood actually impair the ability of these neurons to migrate and actually connect at the level they're supposed to connect with in order to have normal brain function. And there's all kinds of chemicals, neuroleptic drugs, psychiatric drugs have a big issue in this area, and you can just go on, with all the toxins in the environment. This is very apparent in Vietnam with the dioxin toxicity, that caused abnormal limb formation, as well as all kinds of cognitive problems with the babies in Vietnam. So I just pretty much explained this, so we don't need to spend any more time on that. So let's just take a look at it. Oops.
As the tiny fetus grows, the neurons make their way out from inside the neural tube to build the brain, layer upon layer, like an onion. The neurons follow a cellular pathway, as if they were traveling down a highway. They just grab hold of supporting cells called glia and propel themselves along.
They put their nucleus in the back of the cell, which makes them sort of fat in the back, and then they hold on to the guide wire, this glial fiber. So it's kind of like an inchworm as it moves along. And each little cell goes all by itself in what is a very, very vulnerable process. No other kind of cell has to do that, and it's just an amazing thing.
Neurons travel in waves, millions every day, embarking on a daunting expedition that scientists call migration.
It's an amazing phenomenon because it's as if they are going across the country. I mean, in terms of the distances relative to their size, they're making a huge odyssey through all kinds of foreign territory. And the most amazing thing about this migration is that they generally do it without mistakes. They're following cues along the way that are telling them exactly where to go.
For years, scientists wondered how the migrating neurons find their place in the brain. Do the neurons simply travel in herds, gliding down a glial highway which takes them to their final destination? Or do neurons do their own driving, each neuron genetically programmed to fulfill its own predetermined purpose?
We used to think that migration was just like delivering cells out a conveyor belt, and we just dump out the cells at the end. But now we know that's not the case.
It's a fascinating process. And just remember that when she mentioned the fact that this migration is dependent upon not only genetics but on environmental cues, the environmental cues are the molecules that are present in the area of migration that are to some extent determined not only by the nutrition, in this case of the mother, but also other things that the mother may be taking, or stress response that releases all kinds of different molecules that can possibly impinge, in addition to the cortisol that can impinge upon the migration of the neurons. So when you have kids in a war-torn zone and women that are pregnant and they're under this constant stress, can you imagine living in a city that was being bombed all day, like in Iraq, and then at night you didn't get any rest because they were driving through the village with great big loudspeakers playing loud music, and you have a child that's sick and is trying to sleep, so you don't sleep, the child doesn't sleep, the child's going to have, there's no way you can escape abnormal development in an environment like that. So you're guaranteeing another generation of individuals that is going to not be able to function as a fully competent human being has the capacity to do if the development takes place in a way that's consistent with normal development. And that includes, what we need as far as the milieu, the environment around the child, including the caregivers, including the air and the water and nutrition, exposure to the environment, adverse conditions there. So all this comes into play. So you can't think of war, you can't think of violence without thinking of causing some kind of brain damage. And the vets coming back from wars, are evidence of that. The same thing takes place in, for example, there's a lot of research going on for women that have had, for example, abortions, where the PTSD rate is somewhere up around 40%. So there are all kinds of exposures that we have that can actually affect the way we see the world with our brain and the way we respond to perceptions that we receive from the world. So this is just we mentioned this morning that we have this prefrontal cortex. In the middle area of the prefrontal cortex, one of the capacities that it has is a process called regulation of there's a system in the body called the sympathetic nervous system, which is kind of the accelerator, and there's another system in the body called a parasympathetic, which is kind of the brakes. So when you balance those, this balancing is done, in the prefrontal cortex, in this middle area. What is also done there is response flexibility. You choose how you respond giving an incoming stimulus. So if it's a positive one, you respond a certain way. If it's a negative one, you can respond a certain way. But you now have the capacity to choose, okay? So this is response flexibility. Another one is emotional regulation. So we'll take a look at a few more of them, but there's actually 9 altogether. One of them includes morality, which is modulated by this area of the brain. So we know that morality includes things like empathy and care and compassion, and the ability to get along with one another, being kind. So this is one of the reasons why they're using, for example, so much of the processes that actually affect this area of the brain directly. And we mentioned some of them earlier today, and one of them, of course, is meditation, breath awareness, and things like that, centering prayer. They all have a dramatic effect on this area of the brain, and what they do is they cause integration of different areas of the brain, making them work cohesively together. And we mentioned that the DSM-4, and the same thing with the DSM-5, that basically every psychiatric disorder is somehow related to an obstruction of normal integration within or between certain areas of the brain. So here we are. This fellow is quite a remarkable person, and where he came from and how he's able to see the world now and did then. So even with that horrible experience, it's what you do in the situation. So you can actually, in some sense, grow, because there are people that were involved in the Holocaust that were tortured, that were deprived of food, that were sick much of the time, and yet they found ways to comfort and care for their fellow prisoners. So there's a different dynamic going on there, And we talked about what we do actually affects the brain. So we can imagine Victor becoming more and more compassionate the more and more he did that. And the more he became sure that this was a thing to do, regardless of whether or not he was going to be sleep deprived as a result of doing something like this, or was going to be tortured, or maybe he'd be involved in one of those horrendous medical experiments that was going on. But this is so he's a psychiatrist and a neurologist. So obviously his experience seemed to push him in a certain direction, and so now he's trying to help people that have had similar horrendous experiences. So this is a book that was published recently. It's probably one of the top anthropologists in the world today. He's from Denmark. So he threw this out as a challenge to peoples of Earth. How can war and the threat of war be eliminated? How can a social system where bloodshed and mass destruction remain ever-present, an ever-present danger, be replaced by a social universe which peace and security are not merely dreams for the future, but become the new social and political realities of the present? And the book was by Douglas Fry, and it's War, Peace, and Human Nature, the Convergence of Evolutionary and Cultural Views. So remember I talked about the propensity of the media to pick up on the evolutionary psychology that's being advocated by the Hobbesian advocates, that humans are naturally aggressive and naturally violent, naturally selfish. This whole book was an attempt to undermine and discount what's going on by hard data that's been collected about our history. And the history of humanity is one that is pervaded, not with violence and aggression, but is pervaded with care and compassion and sociality, mercy, sharing, generosity. So we go back and look at that tradition, which is, what they're saying is about 30 million years. Compare it to the 6,000 years that we talked about earlier. So we have that whole period of time in which our genes were actually, our chromosomes were actually developing. And they had the capacity to express a certain kind of behavior as a result of development taking place in a certain way. So when they went back and looked at some of the history of that period, what they were finding was that if you could, at this moment in history, define the best way to nurture your children, your offspring, and to ensure peace and tranquility in your community, you'd be doing it not like we're doing it today, but like it was done previously. So when people say, well, that's not natural or that's ridiculous, but it is natural. It is natural to be kind and compassionate. It is natural to be sympathetic. It's natural to be empathic. It's unnatural to kill. It's unnatural to be selfish. In other words, what I'm saying is that we have been given capacities as far as our brains are concerned. So when Jesus says, the first thing is change your mind. So so he's in this 6,000 year milieu. He's after. So is this kind of a self-correction for humanity to say, well, here's what you have the capacity to do, to love one another as I have loved you. It's not something strange or foreign. It's something you already have the genes to express in any situation. And we've seen people suffer and die as a result of that. Martin Luther King was an incredible example of that, recently. So it's not something abnormal. It's not something weird. It's not something that's dysfunctional. It's something that's natural. So even the big neuroscience departments are really, it's quite amazing. Like the first slide we show, forget about survival of the fittest. It's kindness that counts. And that's what actually ensures survival. Not a survival at a mediocre or a subpar level, but the best, most transcendent kind of interaction that we have the capacity to undertake as human beings, because that's the gift that we've been given. And the more we strive to develop those capacities, the more so-called natural, even though they are natural, but we have to work our way into them. If we don't know what our previous history has wrought us as far as brain structure is concerned. So a lot of the things that we do are attributable to what we experienced before. Because until you're about 3 years old, you don't remember anything. Most of your memory is what they call implicit memory. That is, it gets encoded, but it never gets consolidated. So it's like free-floating memory that you have no access to, but that can show up uncalled for at any moment. So let's just imagine that I'm a vet and I got caught in an ambush, trying to cross the river outside of Dong Ha, Vietnam. And 15 men were killed, a lot were wounded, and the person that's leading the group is severely wounded. So this is an experience that's happening, at the moment. And the thought is, how does that get incorporated into memory? Well, if you're in a stressful situation like that, basically the part of your brain that's going to create a recallable memory is offline. It cannot function. So, for example, for 9/11, there's a woman, a psychiatrist, I forget her name. She wrote a book, and it was directly related to the response that was ensured by the way that the media kept showing the planes hitting the towers. So this is that patterned, repetitive behavior that we're seeing, and it has an effect, on our consciousness and the way we perceive what's going on. So she said that what happened was, what normally happens in a highly stressful situation is that the hippocampus goes offline, and the area of the brain that's involved with fear and aggression is the one that does the processing. And this is not the kind of processing that creates recallable memory. So, for example, if someone, for example, was in New York at the time, and there was a certain sound they associated with that, and when they heard that sound or saw whatever they were looking at, the fire or people jumping from the building, they were in a high state of stress. So it doesn't get into the part of the brain that's necessary to produce the kind of memory that we can work with. Because we can recall things and we can kind of solidify them in one way or another, or make more links with other experiences we've had since then and make sense of what happened. Well, if your hippocampus is offline, this just goes in as data. And it can be expressed in any moment, on any day, and it's expressed not as a memory, but it's expressed as emotional, behavioral, perceptual, or somatosensory, or all four at once. So the vet walking down the street in New York City, here's the backfire. I mean, this guy's been to Afghanistan and Iraq. He's walking down the street, and all of a sudden he hears a loud bang, maybe an explosion, just from something that had nothing to do with violence, had nothing to do with war. So he's got a response that includes emotion, that is the fear, perception that he might be killed, because this is someone that's trying to kill him. This is a kind of a noise he heard and when his buddy was killed or something like that. And the somatosensory response, he may feel a tightness of the chest. He may actually start to run and duck for cover. But he has no way of controlling that until someone works at that with him and identifies the relationship between those experiences and what experiences he had in the war. So that's one of the big components of PTSD, is this implicit memory. It's not recallable memory. It's like when it appears, it's not like it was something that's recalled. So it includes a lot of other things, including, priming. And this is a form of priming where he had a previous adverse experience. And as a result of that, now he's more sensitive to explosions or loud noises or what have you. All right. I did. That's all right. All right, let me just kind of wrap up here because we only have a few minutes left, like 5 of them. I think one of the most important things to take away from this is the incredible plasticity of the human brain and the kinds of systems that we can bring online that allow us not to only empathize with other people if they're in distress, but at the same point to be thinking cognitively about the creative steps that we can take to ensure that whatever is causing their suffering or anxiety can be alleviated, or at least partially alleviated, or even moved in just the smallest right direction by their interaction with us. And to remember that your interaction with other people begins kind of with the face, because most of communication takes place through the face, through the affect that the face presents to another individual. I have a real hard time in my parish, it's a Catholic parish, that they do the sign of peace. And when they do the sign of peace, like I was in Birmingham for that course that we taught at the University of Alabama, and we went to a church, it was a Catholic church, it was Martin Luther King's anniversary, birthday, so to speak, and it was Martin Luther King Day, I mean. And about half of the population in the parish at this mass was black. And the guy that took me there was Jim Douglas, who wrote the book JFK, The Unspeakable. And he was with his wife, and they have a home that they have open for people that are suffering from poverty or homelessness. So Jim said to me, he said, now, this is going to take a while. He said, this is going to be different for you. And I couldn't believe how different it was, because in our parish, if I'm sitting next to someone or someone turns around to shake hands with me and I put my hand out, that person 99 times out of 100 averts their eyes. So instead of looking at my face, they go like this, or they just turn away like that, like ah. but the whites and the blacks in the church were just they circulated throughout the whole church, and there was no way you could get away from being hugged, even if you wanted to. So I was thinking maybe I start that in my parish when I get back, because it was profound, and it really means something, because touch is such a powerful entity too. You can't imagine the biochemical reactions that take place, from an affectionate touch from another individual. That's an embrace, that means kindness and welcoming. So I'll leave it there, and we have a question and answer coming up with Charlie at 3:30. And, if you want both of us to be involved in that, fine. If you just want to do the, based upon what Charlie did, that's fine too. So we're open to either approach. So why don't you take a nice welcome break, and we'll see you back at 3:30.